Overview of the cognitive model of anxiety, a state of heightened vulnerability. The cognitive perspective on anxiety centers on the notion of vulnerability. Beck, Emery, and Greenberg defined vulnerability as a person's perception of himself as subject to internal or external dangers over which his control is lacking or is insufficient to afford him a sense of safety. In clinical syndromes, the sense of vulnerability is magnified by certain dysfunctional cognitive processes. In anxiety, this heightened sense of vulnerability is evident in individuals' biased and exaggerated appraisals of possible personal harm in response to cues that are neutral or innocuous. This primary appraisal of threat involves an erroneous perspective in which the probability that harm will occur and the perceived severity of the harm are greatly overestimated. Rahman noted that fearful individuals are much more likely to overestimate the intensity of threat, which then leads to avoidance behavior. At the same time, anxious individuals fail to perceive the safety aspects of threat-evaluated situations and tend to underestimate their ability to cope with the anticipated harm or danger. This secondary elaborative reappraisal, however, occurs immediately as a result of the primary threat appraisal, and in anxiety states it amplifies the initial perception of threat. Thus, the intensity of an anxiety state depends on the balance between one's initial appraisal of threat and the secondary appraisal of coping ability and safety. The level or intensity of anxiety can be expressed in the following manner. When high anxiety, increased threat probability, severity, and decreased coping and safety. When low anxiety, decreased threat probability, severity, and increased coping and safety. When moderate anxiety, use threat probability, severity, and coping safety together. Beck and Greenberg noted that the perception of danger sets off an alarm system involving primal, behavioral, psychological, and cognitive processes that evolve to protect our species from physical harm and danger. Behavioral mobilization to deal with the danger might involve a fight or flight response, but it could also consist of other instrumental behaviors like calling for assistance, taking a defensive stance, or negotiating to minimize the danger. Autonomic arousal and other psychological responses that occur during threat vulnerability are important aspects of this early reflexive defense system. The presence of anxiety activates behavioral mobilization to deal with perceived threat. Although this primal behavioral mobilization evolves as a rapid and efficient response to physical danger, it can impair actual performance when activated in benign situations or the complex, diffusely stressful circumstances of contemporary society. Mobilization of the primal defense system can also have adverse effects when it is interpreted as signaling a serious disorder, such as when the person with panic disorder misinterprets an elevated heart rate as a possible myocardial infarct. A second type of behavioral response often seen in anxiety states a result of a perception of threat is immobility in situations where active coping might increase the actual or imagined danger. It is associated with the cognitive perspective of being totally helpless. The immobility response is apparent in social anxiety, such as when a highly anxious person feels pain when attempting to deliver a public speech. Despite the importance of behavioral mobilization and psychological arousal, it is the initial primary appraisal of threat combined with a secondary appraisal of personal inadequacy and diminished safety that are responsible for instigating anxiety. In this sense, faulty cognition is necessary but not sufficient for generating a state of anxiety. The cognitive model of anxiety is rooted within an information processing perspective in which emotional disturbance occurs because of an excess or deficient functioning of the cognitive apparatus. Previously, we defined information processing as the structures, processes, and products involved in the representation and transformation of being based on sensory data derived from the external and internal environment. Anxiety, then, is the product of an information processing system that interprets a situation as threatening to the vital interests and well-being of the individual. In this case, a threatening meaning is generated and applied to the situation. The centrality of threat meaning assignment is nicely illustrated in an example provided by Beck et al. Most individuals could easily walk across a plank that is 6 inches wide without fear if it were placed 1 foot off the ground. However, raise the plank 100 feet off the ground and most individuals would become intensely afraid and refuse to walk the plank. What accounts for the different emotional experiences in these two situations is that individuals evaluate walking a plank 100 feet above the ground as highly dangerous. They also doubt whether their balance could be maintained and might actually experience dizziness and unsteadiness should they venture a few inches onto the plank. Although the plank is at different heights, their ability to elicit fear or anxiety depends on the perception of danger. Likewise, perceptions of danger are central to clinical states of anxiety. The cognitive model views clinical anxiety as a reaction to an inappropriate and exaggerated evaluation of personal vulnerability derived from a faulty information processing system that misconstrues neutral situations or cues as threatening. Automatic and strategic processing. The cognitive model readily acknowledges that both automatic and strategic processes are involved in anxiety. At the cognitive level, cognitive processing in anxiety has been most clearly demonstrated in the preconscious attentional bias for threat-related stimuli evidenced in emotional strew and dot probe experiments. Findings from implicit memory tests suggest the presence of an automatic memory bias for negative information in anxiety disorders. Classical conditioning research has demonstrated the acquisition of conditioned fear responses to mask fear-relevant stimuli presented outside conscious awareness, indicating that fear learning can occur as an automatic preconscious process. Ledo's research has documented the acquisition of auditory fear responses in rodents via the subcortical thalamoamygdala pathway that bypasses the higher cortical centers for thinking, reasoning, and consciousness. Clearly then, certain cognitive, neurophysiological and learning processes that are critical to the experience of anxiety occur at the automatic processing level. Although automatic processes are important to anxiety, one should not overlook the central role played by the slower, more elaborated and strategic processes in the persistence of anxiety. Threat-biased judgments, reasoning, memory, and thinking are critical parts of the subjective experience of anxiety that motivates individuals to seek treatment. We should not overlook the importance of worry, anxious rumination, threat images, and traumatic memories if we want to understand the anxiety disorders. In fact, controlled strategic processing allows us to interpret novel and complex information. McNally concluded that because of its meaning assignment capabilities, strategic elaborated processing is required for the anxious person to misinterpret innocuous situations as threatening. Moreover, any particular cognitive task involves a mixture of automatic and strategic processing, so a specific aspect of information processing should not be rigidly dichotomized as automatic or strategic, but rather as reflecting more of one type of processing than another. Furthermore, involuntariness rather than preconsciousness is the key feature of automaticity in anxiety states. In the cognitive model, the initial orientation toward threat involves a predominantly automatic preconscious process. Activation of the primal threat mode will be largely automatic because of the necessity for rapid and efficient evaluation of the potential threat for the survival of the organism. The term mode refers to a cluster of interrelated schemas organized to deal with particular demands that pertain to one's vital interests, survival, and adaptation. However, some strategic controlled processing must occur when at this stage of the immediate threat response because of our conscious, subjective experience of this threat associated with the threat appraisal. As we engage in secondary appraisal of coping resources, the presence or absence of safety, and the reappraisal of the initial threat, this aspect of information processing will be much more controlled, strategic, and elaborated. Even at this secondary stage responsible for a sustained anxiety response, processing will not be entirely strategic as evident in processes such as worry and anxious rumination.